The murder only one person noticed vertical bar and Miss Marple mystery. Section 1. The quietest death in St. Mary Mead. The murder was the quietest thing that happened in St. Mary Mead that September, so quiet that nobody noticed it had happened at all. The village noticed the death naturally, a death it could always be relied upon to notice, promptly and with casseroles. But the murder slipped past entirely unobserved, like a guest who leaves before the introductions are made. Nobody noticed, that is, except one elderly lady with pink cheeks, soft white hair, and eyes of a particularly innocent china blue, and even she at first did not know what it was that she had noticed. It began, as most things began in St. Mary Mead, at the fishmonger's. Miss Marple was standing before a modest display of sole and wondering whether kippers might not do just as well, when Miss Hartnell came through the door with the speed and general effect of a weather system. "Honoria Wren," Miss Hartnell announced, without so much as a good morning. "Gone. In the night. Mrs. Pratt found her at 7 this morning, sitting in her chair by the parlour fire, cold as, well." Miss Hartnell moderated herself with an effort, out of respect for the fish. "Dr. Haydock, says her heart. She'd had a dicky heart for years, as everyone knows. 74 she was. A merciful release, really, if you think of it properly." Miss Marple thought of it properly, in the deliberate way she thought of most things. "How very sad," she said gently. "I saw Honoria only 10 days ago, at the Bring and Buy. She seemed," she paused, selecting her word the way she selected wool, by feel. "Bright. Bright." Miss Hartnell seized upon it. "That's exactly it. Bright, like people are before the end. My Aunt Fanny was bright for a week, and then she left the rest to Providence and lowered her voice. The niece will get the house, I suppose. That Larch girl, though why she'd want it, after the way she carried on, shouting in the post office doorway. The whole street heard her." "That was a fortnight ago," said Miss Marple mildly, "and I fancy the shouting was more to do with a young man than with a will." "Young men and wills," said Miss Hartnell darkly, "are generally the same thing underneath." She purchased a haddock with the air of a woman who has done her civic duty and departed, leaving the news behind her like a smell of rain. Miss Marple bought her kippers after all, and walked home by the long way, past the old schoolhouse, where Honoria Wren had lived for the 12 years since her retirement. It was a neat, narrow, grey-stoned house, set a little back from the lane, with a garden that old Judson kept in ferocious order, ranks of dahlias standing to attention, and not a weed daring to show itself. This morning the gate was shut, the curtains of the parlour half drawn, and the whole house had that particular stillness which a house puts on when death is inside it, like a church between services. On the gate-post, quite by accident, Miss Marple's eye fell upon a small thing that had nothing to do with anything, the lid of the dustbin, set not quite straight. Judson would never have left it so. She looked at it a moment reprovingly, and then looked past it, at the parlour window, and wondered, idly she would have said, had anyone asked, why the curtains should be half drawn and not fully drawn, as was decent, or fully open, as was natural. Half drawn was neither one thing nor the other. Half drawn was a decision somebody had failed to finish. She was still thinking about the curtains when she fell into step, at the corner, with Dr. Haydock. "A sad business about Miss Wren," said Miss Marple. Haydock was a brusque, sandy, intelligent man, with the manner of one perpetually late for a more interesting appointment. Heart gave out. She was 74, and the pump was worn. Happens to us all if we're lucky enough to get that far. Was she alone? Mrs. Pratt was upstairs in her own room. Companion housekeeper. Been with her a couple of years. Decent woman by all accounts. Came down at 7. Found her sitting by the fire with a cup of tea beside her, untouched. Thought she was asleep at first. They always think they're asleep. He frowned at the road ahead. She'd have gone off quite peacefully if that's any comfort. These things are merciful mostly. She had seemed so well, said Miss Marple. 10 days ago, at the Bring and Buy, she bought a dozen of my knitted dishcloths and was quite funny about them, and she said such an odd thing. Miss Marple's voice took on its vaguest, woolliest tone, the tone that made sensible men stop listening, which was precisely its function. She said, "One's past has a way of catching one up, Jane, rather like a bill, and mine is sitting in my kitchen at this very moment, shelling peas." Haydock grunted. "Poetic. Old ladies get poetic when the heart's going. Seen it 100 times. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. So have I. They parted at the vicarage corner. The village meanwhile got on with the business of absorbing a death, which it did with practised efficiency. By 10 o'clock the news had reached every parlour. By 11 it had acquired details, most of them imaginary. By noon it had become an occasion. Casseroles were assembled, black gloves were located, and Mrs. Price Ridley was heard to say that she had always expected something of the kind. The poor soul had looked so queer at the Harvest Festival, though no one else could recall Miss Wren looking queer at the Harvest Festival, or indeed ever. The queer note was sounded, in fact, by a humbler voice. It was the butcher's boy who retailed it, at the back doors of the village in the course of his rounds, and from the back doors it travelled to the front parlours, losing nothing in the journey. Mrs. Pratt, it seemed, at the very moment the doctor was being fetched, had stood on her own doorstep wringing her hands and saying, over and over, the strangest thing. She never would use the good china for herself, Miss wouldn't. There's a cup with a crack in it that she favoured, always, and if I'd ever thrown it out she'd have had my head, and so I told her. A cracked cup. The village turned this over briefly and discarded it, the meanderings of a distraught woman. Grief made people say foolish things. Why on earth anyone should keep, let alone favour, a cup with a crack in it, when there was a whole set of good Crown Derby in the dresser. The village shrugged and reached for the casseroles, but Miss Marple, sitting at her own tea-table that afternoon, did not discard it. She sat quite still, her knitting resting in her lap, her pink cheeks a little pinker in the firelight, and she let the cracked cup lie in her mind beside the half-drawn curtains and the dustbin lid set crooked, and the queer bright remark about the past shelling peas in the kitchen. 4 small things. None of them meant anything. That was what was interesting about them. Separately they were less than nothing. Together they were like the first stitches of a pattern one had knitted before, somewhere, though one could not yet remember where. She was reminded, faintly, absurdly, of old Mrs. Saunders at the post office years ago, who had known her husband was poisoning the parrot, a long story, and quite another matter, because of the way he always wiped the perch. It was never the large things. The large things were what people arranged for you to see. It was the small things they forgot to arrange. Half-drawn curtains, said Miss Marple aloud to the empty room, a crooked dustbin lid, and a cracked cup. She picked up her knitting again, and the needles began to click, soft and regular, like a clock thinking. And poor Honoria, who noticed everything. For that was the other thing the village said of Honoria Wren, had said of her for 12 years, fondly and a little fearfully, that nothing got past her. A governess all her working life, at great houses up north, she had carried into retirement a governess's eyes, mild, grey, and frightfully attentive. She knew whose boy was courting whose girl before the parents did. She knew which of the tradesmen's bills were going unpaid. She had once, it was said, told the vicar his sermon before he preached it, having watched him mislay his spectacles on the Saturday and guess what he would do about it. She noticed things. It was her talent and her pleasure, and the village had always felt she exercised it harmlessly. It had never occurred to anyone in St. Mary Mead that noticing things might one day be dangerous. Miss Marple sat on into the dusk. The fire fell lower, and at last she rose, drew her curtains, fully, as was decent, and made a small note in the back of her gardening diary, in her fine spidery hand, of the 4 small things. She did not know what they meant, but she had lived a long time, and she had learnt that when small things gather together of their own accord, like hens before a storm, it is as well to count them. Poor Honoria, she said softly, closing the diary. How very much I hope I am wrong. And Miss Marple, turning in at last toward her bed, found that she did not believe in the merciful release, not one word of it. Section 2. The whole village has a theory. She did not believe it, and the disbelief was still sitting on her doorstep with her the following morning, when Miss Hartnell came up the path for the second time in 2 days, carrying a jar of damson jam, and wearing the expression of a woman who has several things to say, and intends to say all of them. "You'll have heard the latest," said Miss Hartnell, which was what everyone in St. Mary Mead said to everyone else that week, generally about matters the hearer had not heard and the speaker had largely invented. Miss Marple held the door wider. "Do come in, dear. The kettle is on." They sat in the parlour, and Miss Hartnell, accepting tea with one hand, deployed the news with the other. The funeral was to be Friday. Mrs. Pratt was bearing up wonderfully, considering. The niece, that Larch girl, was coming down from London, which was only to be expected, though the cheek of it, after the scene in the post office doorway, and the will, according to the postmistress, who had it from the solicitor's clerk's young lady, was likely to be interesting. Interesting, repeated Miss Marple, pouring. The house, said Miss Hartnell, and the money. 200 a year she had, besides whatever she saved, and governesses save, you know, like squirrels. Where's it all to go? That's what everyone's asking. There's the niece, naturally. But there was bad blood, Mary. The whole street heard it. You'd be better off if I were dead, shouted in the public street by the girl herself. Mrs. Carter heard it with her own ears, and very nearly dropped her bacon. Dear me, said Miss Marple, and what did Miss Wren say to that? Nothing, they say. Just stood there in the doorway, quite white, with her hand on the jam, and the girl flung off down the street. That was a fortnight ago, and now the old lady's dead, and the girl's coming back for the funeral in a new hat, I dare say. Miss Hartnell sipped her tea with grim satisfaction. I don't pretend to know what it all means, but I know what it looks like. Yes, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. That is so often the difficulty, isn't it? What things look like. She listened. It was her great gift, listening. People forgot she was doing it, while Miss Hartnell, refueled by a second cup, worked through the village's theories one by one, like a sorter at the post office dealing with the morning mail. Theory 1. The niece had quarrelled with her aunt over money, and the shock of the quarrel had finished the old lady's heart a fortnight later, which was not murder, but was certainly disrespectful. Theory 2. Mrs. Pratt, the companion, was a queer one, kept herself to herself, came from goodness knew where up north, and a woman in her position, alone in the house all night with an elderly invalid, well, one simply hoped everything had been quite regular. Theory 3. Advanced by Mrs. Price Ridley and already gaining ground at the Women's Institute. It was a judgment Honoria Wren, for all her church-going, had a past. Everyone had always known she had a past. She had arrived in the village 12 years ago with no references anyone had actually seen, and far too much good china, and a past, in the nature of things, caught up with one. Shelling peas in the kitchen, murmured Miss Marple. What was that, dear? Nothing, nothing. Something Honoria said to me once. Miss Marple set down her cup. And the tea was untouched, I hear. The cup by her elbow. The tea! Miss Hartnell blinked at this abrupt descent from scandal to crockery. Yes, so Mrs. Pratt told the doctor. Stone cold, the cup, and her gone. Why? No reason, said Miss Marple vaguely. One likes to picture things correctly, that is all. But the correct picture was proving remarkably elusive, and she was still turning it over 2 afternoons later at the vicarage, where Griselda Clement had assembled what she called a tiny funeral baking committee, and what the village called, less kindly, a headquarters. The vicar's wife was young, pretty, and energetically incompetent, in a way that the village found restful. She presided over the tea things like a cheerful colonel who has mislaid the battle. "We're doing the ham for after the service," said Griselda, "and Mrs. Cray is doing the cakes, though her cakes are a penance, and I've told the Women's Institute they may do sandwiches if they keep to egg. Mary, you're frowning at the cream jug. Is it cracked?" "Not the jug," said Miss Marple. "Everything's cracked in this house," said Griselda cheerfully. "The jug, the curate, the organ, Leonard's patients. What were we saying? Dr. Haydock, who had come in late and taken the chair nearest the fire, stretched out his long legs and answered the question that had not been asked. "You're all talking about Honoria Wren, so is everyone else. And I'll tell you what I told the Women's Institute. There is nothing to talk about. A lady of 74 with a heart like a burst accordion has died in her chair, and if that surprises anyone in this room, they've led a sheltered life." "You saw her 3 weeks ago, I think you said," said Miss Marple. "I did. Blood pressure up, pulse irregular, the usual picture. I told her to take it easy, and she told me she'd been taking it easy since 1912. He gave his short bark of a laugh. Sharp as a needle she was, sharper than most of my patients who'll live to 90, and the cup of tea by her elbow was untouched. Haydock's eyes came round to her, not quickly. He was not a man who moved quickly, but with a new attention. Yes, stone cold. She took her cocoa at 9, Pratt said, regular as clockwork. That night she seems to have asked for tea instead, drunk none of it, and gone to sleep by the fire for the last time. Why does the cup interest you, Miss Marple? Oh, it doesn't interest me, said Miss Marple, looking extremely interested in her knitting. Only, Honoria never drank tea in the evening. She told me so herself, at the bring and buy. Tea kept her awake, she said, and at her age one guarded one's sleep. Cocoa at 9, always cocoa. She was quite funny about it. She said the whole of her life ran on cocoa and habit, and she was too old to give up either. There was a small silence, the kind that occurs when a dropped stitch is discovered several rows down. Cocoa's no good for a bad heart either, said Haydock at last, but he said it slowly, and he was no longer looking at the fire. Old people are capricious. They change their little ways the way they change their chairs. Yes, agreed Miss Marple, they do, though I should have said, she paused, counting stitches, or appearing to, that Honoria was the least capricious woman in St. Mary Mead. That was the whole of her, really. Habit. She said once that a habit was a rail one laid down in one's youth so that one's old age could run along it. It was the day she told me the trains had been much better in 88. Jane, said Griselda, who had been following this with the expression of a spaniel watching a door, you sound as if you think something is wrong. I think a great many things are wrong, dear. The price of wool, for one. Miss Marple rolled her knitting with small, precise movements and looked up, and for a moment the vicarage parlour saw the other Miss Marple, the one beneath the fluff, whose blue eyes were neither vague nor gentle at all. But I will tell you what sits in my mind, since you ask. Honoria Wren, who was all habit, broke her habit on the last night of her life. She asked for tea instead of cocoa, or so we are told. She left it untouched, which was unlike her, for she was a woman who had polished her manners as bright as her furniture, and an untouched cup is bad manners even to oneself. Her curtains were left half drawn, which is neither decent nor natural, and her dustbin lid, said Haydock faintly, was crooked. Judson would never have left it crooked. The man is a sergeant major with a rake, which means someone else moved the dustbin, in the dark, and did not set the lid back straight. People who creep about dustbins at night, Dr. Haydock, are not usually bringing things to the house. They are taking things away. Miss Marple tucked her knitting into its bag. None of it means anything, of course. That is exactly what troubles me. Nothing ever means anything in my experience, until it is made to. Haydock stood up, walked to the window, and stood looking out at the vicarage lawn, where the light was going early as it did in September. He was a good doctor and an honest man, and he had signed the certificate himself, and that signature was now sitting on his conscience like a small cold stone. What precisely, he said at last, without turning round, are you suggesting? Oh, I never suggest anything, said Miss Marple placidly. I only notice things, as poor Honoria did, and I find myself wondering whether there might not be, just to set one's mind at rest, a quiet word with someone in authority. Not an investigation, nothing so dreadful, just a word. It would be so unfortunate if the funeral were Friday, and afterwards one found oneself wishing one had said a word sooner. Haydock turned round. He looked at the little old lady by the fire, fluffy, pink, knitting-bagged, and something in his medical soul, the part of him that had never quite trusted a tidy diagnosis, stirred uneasily. Slack, he said. Inspector Slack's the man. He'll think I'm a fool. He paused. He may be right. Another pause. Longer. I'll have a word with him tonight. That is all one asks, said Miss Marple, rising and gathering her gloves. And now I really must be getting home, or my own cocoa will be waiting. I always take cocoa at 9, you know. One lays down the rails in one's youth. She was at the garden gate when Haydock caught up with her, hat in hand, to open it for her. Over the lane, over the early dusk, the church clock struck 6, and down the road the lights were coming on in the little houses one by one, and in one house they were not. Miss Marple, said Haydock gruffly, if I do speak to Slack, and mind, I think I'm an arse for doing it, have you anything more than curtains and dustbin lids? Because that's all I shall have when he starts laughing. Miss Marple stood at the gate with the dusk gathering round her, and she thought of the 4 small things in the back of her gardening diary, and of Honoria Wren's grey governess eyes, that had noticed everything for 12 harmless years. "I have a feeling," she said quietly, "and I have never yet learnt to distrust my feelings, Dr. Haydock. They are the only relatives I have who never deceive me." She went through the gate and up the lane towards home, and behind her, at the top of the village, a car she recognized, a police car, though she was not supposed to recognize it, was standing outside the old schoolhouse with its lamps burning, and a large, suspicious-looking man in a belted raincoat was getting out of it and looking at the house as the house deserved. Inspector Slack had come to St. Mary Mead. Section 3. Inspector Slack goes about it the wrong way. Inspector Slack had come to St. Mary Mead, and by 9 o'clock the next morning the whole village knew it. Knew it, indeed, before the inspector himself had finished his breakfast at the Blue Boar, because the landlord's daughter had seen the car, and the landlord's wife had seen the notebook, and between the two of them they constructed a narrative of blackmail, forgery, and a body in the well which was retailed, with confidence, at 11 different breakfast tables. The truth was duller, and Slack made it duller still by the manner of his going about it. He was a big, red-faced, energetic man with a loud voice and a fixed conviction that crime was committed by the lower orders or by theatrical persons, and he had come, he made no secret of it, under protest. The doctor had got at the chief constable had got at him, and here he was, wasting a fine September Wednesday poking about a house where an old lady had died of what old ladies died of. He stood in the parlour of the old schoolhouse with his hat in his hand and his prejudices fully armed, and he looked round the room where Honoria Wren had spent her last evening, and he saw, as he was meant to see, a room of blameless respectability, a good fire laid, a shelf of worn books, the Crown Derby in the dresser, a lady's chair by the hearth with a work-basket beside it, a sock in the basket with a needle still stuck in the heel. Mrs. Pratt stood in the doorway, twisting her apron. She was a thin, upright, faded woman of 50-odd, with grey hair screwed back and the wary, bruised manner of someone who had been apologizing all her life. She answered his questions in a low voice, correctly, uselessly. "Yes, sir, I made the tea. 8:30 it would be." She asked for tea, which was unusual. She took cocoa as a rule, but she said the night had a chill in it, and she fancied tea. I brought it in, and she was sitting just there, by the fire, and I said good night, and she said good night, and that was the last. Her voice frayed on the last word, and she pressed the apron to her mouth. In the morning she was sitting there, and I thought she was asleep. God forgive me, I was glad. I tiptoed. And then the tea was cold, and I touched her hand. There, said Slack, with the heavily manufactured kindness of a man who suspects everyone and pities no one. "Now, relations. There's a niece, I understand, Miss Larch, and there was a quarrel. In the post-office doorway, I understand. In front of witnesses, I understand." He repeated, "I understand," as other men crack a whip. Mrs. Pratt's faded eyes lifted to him, and for a moment something came into them that was not grief and not fear, but was very like contempt. "The young lady has a temper, sir, and her aunt had a tongue when she chose. Families is families. It wasn't murder. Whatever the village says, the village would say the vicar murdered the organ if it got the chance." "Nobody has said the word murder, Mrs. Pratt," said Slack, who had been thinking of nothing else since breakfast. "We'll leave the word murder out of it." But the word murder had been left in it by an old lady in a house at the other end of the village, and at 11:30 that morning Miss Marple, coming back from the vicarage, where she had been consulted about the ham, found the inspector himself planted in the lane outside the old schoolhouse, interrogating a dustbin. More precisely, he was interrogating Judson, the gardener, over the dustbin, and Judson, a gnarled walnut of a man, with a soldier's back and a poacher's eye, was giving him no satisfaction. "The lid was on crooked," said Slack. "When did you last put it on straight?" "Tuesday," said Judson. "I does the bins Tuesdays, on straight, proper, like I always does. 30 years I've done bins, and I never set a lid crooked in my life, and I'd thank you to write that down in your book. And between Tuesday and Friday. Anyone might have been at it. It's a bin, not a bank." Judson folded his arms. "Tramps, boys, foxes, repeated Slack coldly. "Foxes is very clever with their paws," said Judson with perfect gravity, "when they've a mind to be." It was at this point that he observed Miss Marple, and his whole walnut face creased into something that was, for Judson, warmth. He touched his cap. Slack turned and looked Miss Marple up and down with the sour recognition of a man who had met her kind before, on committees, at fêtes, in the front row of inquests, and had learnt to fear them. "Good morning, Inspector," said Miss Marple brightly. "I do hope you are not letting Judson's foxes keep you from your proper business. Though it is true about the foxes, they took 3 of my neighbour's pullets last spring, and the cunning of it was quite remarkable. They took them through a hole that was boarded up, if you can imagine it. It was not the hole one was watching, you see. One had watched the wrong hole." Slack looked at her with the hollow patience of a man enduring a sermon. "Thank you, madam. We are not investigating poultry." "No," said Miss Marple. "Of course not." She stood a moment, beaming, apparently in no hurry to be anywhere, her eyes travelling over the little scene with leisurely enjoyment. The inspector, the dustbin, the half-drawn parlour curtains behind him. "I only wondered," she went on chattily, "whether you had had a word yet with Mr. Tum, the fishmonger's van man. He delivers on Thursday evenings. He would have passed this gate on Thursday night. One sees so much from a van. Though, of course," she added, with the air of one apologizing for a foolish fancy, "I am sure you have thought of Mr. Tum." Slack had not thought of Mr. Tum, and was damned if he would say so. He made a non-committal noise and wrote something in his notebook that was probably Mr. Tum, and possibly something shorter. "And the curtains," said Miss Marple, in the same woolly, meandering tone. "I noticed them half-drawn on the Friday morning, and it struck me as so curious, Judson. You will remember how particular Miss Wren was about the curtains. She told me once that in great houses a half-drawn curtain was the sign of a death in the family, and that one drew them fully or not at all. If she felt herself unwell that evening, the heart, you know, gives warning, does it not? She might have begun to draw them, and found herself unable to finish. It would account for it so naturally." She paused. "Unless, of course, someone else drew them, for her, afterwards, but only halfway, which is the curious part, as though the person knew something ought to be done about curtains, but did not know what. A person, perhaps, who had never lived in a great house." There was a silence. Judson looked at the curtains. Slack looked at Miss Marple. Miss Marple looked at the tip of Judson's dahlias and remarked that the frost would get them if he did not take them up soon. Slack cleared his throat with a sound like a lorry changing gear. "The doctor tells me," he said, with elaborate, dangerous patience, "that you have been putting it about, madam, that there is something wrong with this death. Let me tell you what is wrong with it. Nothing. There is no wound, no poison bottle, no letter, no strangers in the village, and the door was on the latch as it always was, in a village where doors are on the latch. What there is a quarrel with a niece, and I shall speak to the niece, and I expect she'll turn out to be a hard-faced young woman from London, with a young man I shan't like, and then we shall all go home." He shut his notebook with a snap. "Villages, madam, are full of eyes, and everything that eyes see late at night gets magnified, if you'll forgive me, into murder." "How true that is," said Miss Marple, with such warmth that he looked at her sharply. "Everything the eyes see gets magnified. That is exactly what poor Honoria used to say. She said the village had 1,000 eyes, and they were all at the front windows, and that was why nobody ever saw what happened at the back door. Well," she gathered her basket, "I mustn't keep you, Inspector. I am sure you are quite right. An old lady, a cold night, a worn-out heart. It is what old ladies die of." She smiled at him, pink and woolly and mild. "Only, when you speak to Mrs. Pratt again, do ask her about the cup." "The cup?" said Slack, not as a question. "The teacup, the one by her elbow, untouched. Mrs. Pratt says it was one of the good Crown Derby, and Mrs. Pratt says Miss Wren never used the good china for herself. There was a cup with a crack in it that she favoured, always, so someone brought her tea in the Crown Derby cup, and she, who favoured the cracked one, never drank from it, and whoever washed the dishes that night washed the cracked cup too, and put it back in the dresser, quite clean among the others. It is the cleanest cup in the dresser, Inspector. I noticed it through the window just now, on its shelf, shining. Everything else in that house is dusty with a death. The cracked cup is clean." Miss Marple's voice was still gentle, still meandering, only the eyes had gone very bright and very cold, like a winter sky. One would almost think somebody wanted that cup washed. Do ask Mrs. Pratt who washed up that night. Good morning, Inspector. Good morning, Judson. Mind the frost takes your dahlias." She went off down the lane at her small, unhurried pace, and Slack stood where she had left him, between the dustbin and the curtains, looking after her with his mouth slightly open. "Who," he said at last to Judson, "is that woman?" "That," said Judson, picking up his rake, "is Miss Marple. And if I was the party that washed that cup, I'd be sweating now." Section 4. The Girl in the New Hat. If Judson's remark reached the party who had washed the cup, it produced no visible perspiration, but within 2 days the village had something far better than a sweating suspect. It had a villain. She arrived on the Thursday train, the day before the funeral, in a neat black coat and a new black hat, and she was seen in order by the station master, the porter, Mrs. Carter of the general shop, and the entire population of the Red Lion saloon bar, all of whom agreed afterwards, with the satisfaction of profits rewarded, that she was exactly what they had expected. Vera Larch was 26, thin, dark, and vividly pretty in the careless modern way that St. Mary Mead found faintly indecent. She had a white face, a straight back, a red mouth that she did not trouble to soften, and the particular stillness of a person holding a door shut on a great deal of noise. She took a room at the Blue Boar. She paid for it in advance. When Mrs. Price Ridley, encountering her in the post office, offered a stiff little speech of condolence, Vera said thank you in a clear, hard voice, and bought a stamp and walked out, and by the time she reached the Blue Boar the story had been round the village that she had said thank you for nothing, and had bought the stamp to write to her young man about the money. Miss Marple met her on the evening of her arrival, quite by accident, in the churchyard. The churchyard at St. Mary Mead lay behind the church, up a green slope, in a smell of yew and damp stone, and Miss Marple had gone up, as she did most evenings, to do a little light tidying among the graves, which she called gardening, and which was, in fact, reconnaissance. The Wren family had no plot. Honoria was to go into a new grave by the east wall, and it was by the east wall, beside the raw yellow rectangle of the opened earth, that Miss Marple found the girl standing, hat in hand, in the failing light. "Good evening, my dear," said Miss Marple. "You will be Vera. I knew your aunt." The girl turned. Up close she was younger than she looked from a distance, and more frightened. The hardness was paint on a door, and there were shadows under her eyes that no paint covered. "Everyone seems to have known my aunt," she said. "The whole village has been telling me about her since I got off the train. What she died of, what she left, what I shouted in the post office. Have you come to tell me what I shouted in the post office?" "No," said Miss Marple placidly, sitting down on the low wall and arranging her skirts. "I heard what you shouted in the post office a fortnight ago. Mrs. Carter told me. You'd be better off if I were dead." She very nearly dropped her bacon, I believe. Vera's mouth twisted. "And now she's dead, and I'm here in a new hat, and the village has me tried and hanged and is only waiting for the coffin as the curtain raiser. Well, I said it. I won't pretend I didn't. Not to you. You look like the sort one can't pretend to. We quarrelled. I said the unforgivable thing, which is generally the true one, and I went to London. And now she's dead, and I'm damned if I'll cry at her funeral to please Mrs. Carter's bacon." "Why did you quarrel?" asked Miss Marple gently. The girl was silent a moment. The light was going. The yews had gone black. Below them the village windows were coming alight one by one, gold squares in the dusk, and the opened grave at their feet was a darker dark in the dark grass. "Money," Vera said at last, flatly. "That's what everyone thinks, so it may as well be what I say. I wanted her to sell this house and the furniture and the china, and go into a comfortable place near me in London, where I could look after her. She wouldn't. She said she'd lived her life in other people's houses, among other people's furniture, dusting other people's china, and this house was hers and she'd die in it, and the girl's voice caught once, like a heel catching on a stair. And she did. So there we are. She won. And the will," said Miss Marple. "I expect you know the village is interested in the will." "Oh, I know about the will." Vera gave a short, ugly little laugh. "The solicitor wrote to me. She left me the house and everything in it, and the money, what there is, to a niece of her own up north, someone I've never heard of, some cousin's girl. There. That's your village sensation. She forgave me the post office, and gave me a grey stone house I didn't want, and I dare say that's the kind of joke she liked. She had a queer sense of humour, Aunt Honoria. You had to watch her to know when she was joking. Most people didn't watch her. They just thought she was a quiet old governess with a tongue. She turned and looked at Miss Marple suddenly, directly, with her aunt's grey attentive eyes. You watched her. She wrote to me about you. There is one woman in this village, she wrote, who sees what she looks at, an old pussy who knits. Mind her, Vera. If ever anything happens to me, mind her. The churchyard was very quiet. A late bird made a small cash register sound in the yew, and was still. Did she? Said Miss Marple softly. Did she indeed? If ever anything happens to me. And did anything ever happen to her before, my dear, that she should write such a thing? Vera stared at her. The paint had come off the door. Behind it the girl was white to the lips. She'd had warnings, she said in a low voice. The heart. Dr. Haydock can tell you. We all knew it could be any night. She made jokes about it. Don't order my mourning yet, Vera. Black is so unbecoming to you. That sort of thing. It was a family joke that she'd outlive us all out of spite. And then she stopped and put her hand flat on the cold stone of the wall, and the hand was shaking. Then last week the landlady of the Blue Boar told me the village says it wasn't her heart. The village says someone helped. And there was a policeman at the house, and he asked Mrs. Pratt about a teacup, and Mrs. Pratt came to me at the inn and cried in my room, and said she couldn't bear it, she who had been so good to Aunt, to be looked at like that by a policeman over a teacup. The girl's voice rose and cracked. So I want to know, you, the old pussy who knits, was it her heart, or wasn't it? Because if someone helped her, if someone put their hands on my aunt, then the village can hang whoever it likes afterwards. But I will know first. I will know. Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment, and there was nothing woolly about her at all. I don't know yet, my dear, she said, but I intend to, and I will tell you what I told Dr. Haydock. If ever a woman died of noticing, it was your aunt. Sit down beside me a minute. The stone is cold, but grief is colder standing. There. Now tell me about the woman who cried in your room, Mrs. Pratt. How did she come to your aunt, and when, and who recommended her, and what do you know of her? I know nothing of her, said Vera. Nobody does. That was one of the things Aunt and I— She stopped. One of the things you quarrelled about, said Miss Marple. I thought as much. Not the house, my dear. The companion. Begin at the beginning, and tell me everything, and do not leave out the small things, because the small things are the only ones that matter. The church clock struck 7 below them, and there, on the low stone wall above the open grave, in the last of the light, Vera Larch began at the beginning, and Miss Marple, with her hands folded on her work-bag and her mild eyes on the girl's white face, listened, and the pattern in her mind, the crooked lid, the curtains, the clean cracked cup, grew 1 stitch wider. Tomorrow was the funeral, and at funerals, Miss Marple had long observed, the whole caste assembles, and everybody watches the coffin, and nobody at all watches the mourners. Section 5. The cleanest cup in the dresser. The funeral of Honoria Wren took place on the Friday, in a thin autumn sunshine that made the churchyard look like a watercolour, the yews very black, the stone very grey, the dahlias on the newer graves very red. The whole village came, as the village always did, a funeral in St. Mary Mead was the one social occasion at which attendance could be achieved without an invitation, and the small crowd in the church had the bright, grave, well-brushed look of people enjoying an emotion they had not had to pay for. Miss Marple sat 3 rows from the front, where she had an unobstructed view of the mourners, and she did what she had resolved to do. She watched the people, and let the coffin alone. Vera Larch sat in the front pew, very straight in the new black hat, and did not cry, and the village, behind its hymn books, noted that she did not cry, and drew its conclusions. Beside her, at a small and careful distance, sat Mrs. Pratt, in a black so ancient and so often retrimmed that it had the patina of grief itself. Mrs. Pratt cried, quietly, correctly, into a clean handkerchief at the proper places, a little too correctly perhaps. Miss Marple, who had attended more funerals than any other lady in St. Mary Mead, and knew the liturgy of tears as well as she knew the liturgy itself, found herself thinking of Mrs. Saunders at the post office, who had wept at her husband's funeral in exactly the right places because she had rehearsed them. That had been the parrot poisoning case. There was no parrot here, but there was a cup. Behind Mrs. Pratt sat Judson, cleaned and uncomfortable, and the vicar read the service in his beautiful amateur voice, and the organ wheezed and the dust danced in the slant of sun above the pews, and Honoria Wren, who had noticed everyone for 12 years, was lowered at last into the ground in the presence of a village that had noticed her hardly at all. Afterwards there was ham at the vicarage, and Griselda's sandwiches, and Mrs. Cray's penitential cakes, and the subdued, pleasurable hum of a village social occasion that has gone off well. It was in the vicarage drawing-room, balancing a plate, that Miss Marple found herself at the elbow of the solicitor, and Mr. Giles, down from Much Benham, a dry little man with a briefcase and the air of finding funerals professionally convenient. "A sad occasion," said Mr. Giles, "though I may say, a gratifying one. The turnout. Miss Wren was respected." "And the will," said Miss Marple vaguely. "One hears such a lot about the will. The house to the niece, I am told, and the money to some cousin's girl up north, was it? Dear me, I forget the name. It was in the village by Saturday. You know how these things are." "The money," said Mr. Giles, with the prim pleasure of a man correcting an error, "goes to a Miss Euphemia Pratt, a great niece of," he consulted his memory, "of the late Mrs. Wren's companion, Mrs. Pratt. The late Miss Wren took a great interest in the girl, paid for her training as a dispenser, I understand. A most unusual arrangement. Most unusual. But Miss Wren was a decided woman. She made the will herself, brought it to us to be witnessed 18 months ago. She said, Mr. Giles permitted himself the ghost of a smile. She said she had spent her life arranging other people's affairs, and she was hanged if she'd let her own arrange themselves." "Euphemia Pratt," said Miss Marple, "the companion's great niece. How very kind of Honoria. She must have been fond of the girl." "She had never met the girl," said Mr. Giles, and took a sandwich. "I asked her that myself, you know. Professionally, one must be sure. She said she was doing it for Mrs. Pratt's sake, that Mrs. Pratt had had a hard life, and deserved that something good should come of her. A very handsome way of putting it, I thought," he chewed. "Between ourselves," the old lady doted on the companion, "wouldn't hear a word against her. The niece, the young lady in the front pew, had some sort of feeling on the subject, I believe, and there was trouble about it, but Miss Wren was adamant. Edith Pratt, she said to me. Edith Pratt, I remember, because it is a name like a hymn. Edith Pratt is the only person in this village who is kind to me without wanting anything. Those were her words." "How touching," said Miss Marple, "and how very interesting. Kindness without wanting anything is so rare, don't you think? One comes across it so seldom that, forgive an old woman, Mr. Giles, that when one does come across it, one always wonders a little." She drifted away with her plate, in her vague elderly way, and left the solicitor frowning faintly at his sandwich, and in the bay of the window, a moment later, she achieved the thing she had come to the funeral to achieve, which was 10 minutes alone with Mrs. Pratt. It was easily done. Everyone was pressing food on the niece. Nobody was pressing anything on the companion, who stood a little apart with her untouched plate in her ancient black, with the air of a woman who is grateful to be overlooked. Miss Marple settled beside her like a small grey bird alighting, and began gently to knit with words. "You were so good to her, my dear. Everyone says so. 2 years, wasn't it? And she was not always easy. Governesses never are. They have had to be right for so long. I hope you feel, one should feel at these times, that there is nothing at all on one's conscience. It is such a comfort afterwards to know one did everything." Mrs. Pratt's faded eyes filled, instantly and precisely. "I did everything," she said, in her low, bruised voice. "Everything there was to do, I did. I was with her night and day, Miss Marple. I never stirred from the house hardly. And now they look at me," the policeman asked me about the washing up. "Me, as if I," she pressed the clean handkerchief to her lips. "I washed the supper things that night, as I always did. I washed her cup. I didn't know it would be the last time. And now that is held against me, that the cup was clean. It is a hard world," said Miss Marple sympathetically, "where a clean cup needs defending. Tell me, dear." She favoured the cracked one, I hear, the one with the brown crack, That was no good to anyone. Wasn't that strange, in a woman with a dresser full of Crown Derby? She said, Mrs. Pratt's voice had gone flat and small, like a child reciting. She said the cracked cup was her conscience. She said it was to remind her of something. I never asked what. You didn't ask her things like that. She had a way of shutting a door with her face, and you'd find yourself on the outside of it, still smiling. She twisted the handkerchief. She'd been a governess in great houses, you know, up north. She never spoke of it, not to me, but sometimes at night she'd sit with that cup and not drink from it, just turn it and turn it in her hands. And once, I wasn't meant to hear, she said to it out loud, It's coming, Edith. It's coming up the drive, and I can't put it down any more than you can. I didn't know what she meant. She saw I'd heard, and she shut the door with her face, and we had our cocoa. The drawing room hummed and glittered around them. The vicar's voice rose genially above the ham, and Miss Marple sat quite still with her plate on her knee, and felt the pattern turn over in her mind, like a key turning in a lock that had been locked for a very long time. It's coming up the drive. She said that, said Miss Marple softly. When, dear? As near as you can remember. The day before, whispered Mrs. Pratt. The Wednesday night. The night before she... The handkerchief went up again, and this time the tears, Miss Marple noted with her cold, kind governess's eye, were real. Real tears, at last, in the wrong place, out of order. Fear, not grief. Or grief so tangled with fear that the woman herself could no longer tell the handkerchief from the wound. There, said Miss Marple, and laid her small, soft, ancient hand over the companion's work-worn one, and left it there, neither an accusation nor a comfort, but a little of both. There, my dear. We none of us put down what we are carrying until it is taken from us. You must remember that. And Mrs. Pratt, her voice dropped so that the woman had to lean to hear it, above the clink of the funeral baked meats. When it is taken from you, and it will be, these things always are, in the end, you come to me, not to the policeman, to me. I live at the end of the lane, past the old schoolhouse, and I am nearly always at home, and I have seen a great deal of the world, mostly in St. Mary Mead, which comes to the same thing. She rose, patted the woman's shoulder, and wandered off towards the cakes, pink and fluffy and faintly absurd, a little old lady who had been comforting the bereaved, and in the bay of the window Mrs. Pratt sat on, with her untouched plate and her real tears, and stared after her as a drowning woman might stare after a boat that has come alongside and not yet thrown a rope. Section 6. What the brass plate knew. The funeral baked meats were hardly cold before the cracks began to show, and they showed first, as cracks so often did in St. Mary Mead, at the Women's Institute. It was the Monday meeting, a talk, ironically, on household hints of the olden days, and Miss Marple sat in the second row with her knitting, apparently absorbed, while around her the village worked the case the way a thrush works a snail, patiently and from every angle. The new detail, which had surfaced over the weekend and was now common property, was this. Mrs. Pratt's great niece, the dispenser's girl, Euphemia, the beneficiary of the money, had visited the old schoolhouse in August. She had stayed 2 nights, and the fishmonger's van man, young Tum, duly interrogated by Inspector Slack on the subject of Thursday nights, had confessed that on the Thursday night in question, delivering late, he had seen a light moving in the old schoolhouse garden after 10 o'clock, a lantern, he thought, or a torch, moving low, near the back. He had thought nothing of it. Gardeners and ghosts, he had told Slack, were not his business. A light in the garden, said Miss Hartnell at the interval, over the Institute tea, at 10 at night, the night she died, and we're to believe that's nothing. It was a night chiller, said Mrs. Price Ridley, who had picked up the word from a wireless serial and used it with relish. The whole thing is a night chiller. The light, the cup, the girl's visit in August. And that woman, that Pratt woman. She lowered her voice to a cathedral whisper. They say she was employed without references. Miss Wren engaged her off a newspaper advertisement. Off a newspaper, Mary. One might as well engage one's murderer and have done with it. People do, dear, said Miss Marple mildly, quite often. That is rather the point of murderers. They come recommended, or they would never be let in. She counted a stitch. Though I must say, I find myself less interested in the light in the garden than in the visit in August. Euphemia Pratt. Did anyone here see her? She stayed 2 nights, I believe. There was a silence of the kind that means nobody knows anything, but everybody is about to say it. Then little Mrs. Cray, the penitential cake maker, who had not spoken all meeting, said in her small crushed voice, "I saw her at the bus stop, a plain girl, 23 or 4, very neat, with a hold-all. She was crying." "Crying?" said Miss Marple. "Waiting for the early bus, the Saturday, crying her eyes out, poor thing, and Mrs. Pratt standing with her with a face like the inside of a cupboard, all shut, and the girl said, 'I was right there with my basket, pretending about my list.' The girl said, 'I won't, Aunt Edith, I won't take it. It's blood money, whatever she says it is.' And Mrs. Pratt said, 'You'll take what you're given and hold your tongue, same as me. It's the only kind of money there is for the likes of us.' And then the bus came. Mrs. Cray looked round the circle of faces with the apologetic air of a woman who has been carrying a bomb for 3 weeks and is relieved to have handed it over. 'I've told Inspector Slack. He wrote it down. Blood money.' Those were the words. The Institute hummed. The talk on household hints resumed, and nobody heard a word of it, and Miss Marple sat knitting in the second row with her blue eyes on her work, and the pattern in her mind turned over once more, and came a little closer to its final shape. Blood money. Not murder money, the girl had been precise, in the way of the young and wretched. Blood money, whatever she says it is. Money paid because of blood. Old blood by the sound of it. The girl had spoken of it as of something settled long ago. A debt, a disgrace, a thing in the family like the brown crack in a cup. Miss Marple walked home slowly by the lane, and stopped, as she had stopped on the first morning, outside the old schoolhouse. It looked smaller now, with the funeral over, a house with its work done. Vera Larch had the keys, and the curtains were open, decently, all the way. On an impulse, Miss Marple went up the path and knocked. Vera opened the door with a duster in her hand and her hair tied up in a scarf, and behind her the little hall was in the disarray of a house being emptied, trunks, newspaper, a crate of books. "I'm clearing," said Vera flatly. "It has to be done and there's no one else to do it. Mrs. Pratt left this morning. Did you know? Gone. Back up north, to her niece, to Euphemia. She came to me at the inn last night and cried again, and said she couldn't stay in the village to be looked at, and this morning she was on the 7 o'clock bus. So now the village will say she's run away, and that will hang her, and perhaps it should. I don't know anything any more. Come in, if you're coming. Mind the crate." Miss Marple came in and sat on the trunk she was directed to, and watched the girl wrap china in newspaper, the Crown Derby, piece by piece in the sheets of the Much Benham Gazette, and presently she said, in her chattiest voice, "Your aunt was a governess up north, I believe, in great houses. Did she ever speak of them?" "Never," said Vera. "Not one word, not ever, and I used to ask. She said her life began when she stopped dusting other people's things. All I know is what I found this morning." She straightened and pushed a strand of hair off her forehead with her wrist. "There's a tin box at the back of the wardrobe, under her winter things, locked, no key. I was going to prise it open with the poker, and then I couldn't. It felt like her, still, her last locked door." She looked at Miss Marple with her aunt's grey eyes. "You said small things are the only ones that matter. There's a small thing for you. A governess of 40 years, with a locked tin box and no key, and a cracked teacup for a conscience. What was she, Miss Marple? What had she done?" "Nothing, I think," said Miss Marple quietly. "That is what I am coming to believe, my dear. She had done nothing. That was her sin, and she paid for it for 40 years. It is the people who have done nothing, you know, who pay longest." She rose slowly and stood in the little hall among the trunks. "Do not prise the box open yet. Leave it one more night, and tomorrow, if you will, bring it to me, and we will open it together, you and I, and one other person who has a better right than either of us to see what is inside." "Who?" said Vera. "Inspector Slack," said Miss Marple. "I shall invite him to tea. He will come because he thinks I am a meddling old fool, and he will stay because by the end of tea he will not think so any longer. Good night, my dear. Wrap the derby carefully. It has survived one household already, which is more than most of us do." She went home down the darkening lane. Behind her, in the window of the old schoolhouse, Vera's lamp moved from room to emptying room, and Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Pratt's shut cupboard face at the bus stop, and the girl's words, "It's the only kind of money there is for the likes of us," and of Honoria, turning the cracked cup in her hands in the evenings, saying it's coming up the drive. Something had come up the drive 12 years ago, and Honoria had seen it and held her tongue. Something had come up the drive again this September, and Honoria had seen that too, and had died of it, and now it was loose in the lanes with the light going, and there was no one watching the back doors of the village at all, no one but a little old lady with pink cheeks, sitting up late over her gardening diary. Adding one stitch to a pattern that was very nearly complete, she wrote in the diary that night, in her fine spidery hand, "Tomorrow, tea for 3. The girl, the inspector, the box." And then, after a long pause, tapping the pen, "The knocker. I must ask about the knocker." She had not told anyone about the knocker. It was the smallest of all the small things, and she had been saving it. Section 7. The Second Cup. The tea for 3 never happened, because St. Mary Mead woke on the Tuesday to its second death. The news came to Miss Marple with her morning milk, delivered by the milkman's boy, who had it from the postman who had been there. Vera Larch had been found at the bottom of the stairs in the old schoolhouse at 6:30 that morning, with a broken teacup beside her and the front door standing open, and she was dead. It was the baker's van that had raised the alarm, the door open at dawn, in that house, with the frost on the step. Dr. Haydock had been there within 20 minutes. There was a stair rod loose at the 4th stair. She had been carrying the last crate of books downstairs in the dark of the early morning. The rod had turned under her heel. An accident, a dreadful, obvious, unlucky accident, in a house full of stacked trunks and loose stair rods, and the whole village said so, at the top of its voice, all morning, with a kind of desperate unanimity, because the alternative was not to be borne. Miss Marple heard it all at her own gate, standing very still with her milk bottle in her hand, and she said nothing at all, which frightened the milkman's boy more than anything she could have said. She walked up to the old schoolhouse at 10 o'clock, past the small crowd at the gate. The village had come out to stare at the house where death had called twice in a fortnight, and it stared with a kind of terror now, the smugness all gone out of it, like a child who has made a game of a ghost and met one. Inspector Slack's car stood in the lane. The door was guarded by a constable who knew Miss Marple, and let her through with a miserable relieved salute, as if she were senior to him. Slack was in the hall, and Haydock with him, and neither of them looked like men in charge of anything. The stair was just as it had been. The rod, the crate burst open on the flags, the books spilled in a fan, and at the foot of the stair a piece of white chalk where Vera had lain. The tin box from the wardrobe, Miss Marple noticed at once, was on the hall table, prized open, empty. "She sent for me last night," said Haydock in a low voice, before Slack could speak. His sandy face was grey. "A note by the butcher's boy at 9 o'clock. I was out on a case and didn't get it till 11, and I thought it could keep. God forgive me, I thought it could keep." He put a folded paper into her hand, and Miss Marple read, in a small, hard, upright hand she had last seen on the churchyard wall, "Dear Dr. Haydock, you were quite right, and the village was quite wrong. I found the letters tonight in my aunt's box. I know everything now, what she was, and what was done, and who is in this village. I have telephoned the person and told them what I have, and asked them to come to the house tomorrow morning and hear what I propose. You may think me a fool, but I want it ended face to face, in this house, where it began. Please come at 8. I don't want to be alone with them. Vera Larch." "The letters," said Slack. He had the tin box open in his big hands, showing the empty inside with the baffled fury of a bear at a rifled hive. "What letters? Where are they? Not on her, not in the house, not in the box. She's found letters, she's telephoned somebody. The exchange says she put through a call at 9:30 last night, to a number in the village. They'd give me the number, only they don't keep note of local calls, which is a regulation I mean to have changed, and this morning she's at the foot of the stair and the letters are gone. An accident." He said the word the way another man would spit. "A loose stair rod. Judson swears he went over this house in August, stair rods included, and every rod was tight as a drum, and Dr. Haydock here," he swung round, "has been whispering in my ear since 7 o'clock about teacups." "There was a cup by her," said Haydock, Smashed under the crate, Crown Derby. She'd taken a tray down with her, the last of the tea things, but she'd been drinking from it. Slack. There were dregs. Tea, drunk, in the cup, at 6:30 in the morning, by a girl who drank coffee. Vera drank coffee. I knew her habits from the inn. She took coffee morning and night and made a joke of it. "Which proves," said Slack dangerously. "What?" "Which proves," said a gentle voice from the doorway, "that the tea was not made by Vera." They both turned. Miss Marple stood in the parlour doorway with her milk bottle still absurdly in her hand, small and grey in the morning light, and her eyes were not vague at all but fixed and very bright, like a bird's. "2 cups," she said. "2 women. Honoria, who drank cocoa at 9, died with a cup of tea untouched at her elbow. Vera, who drank coffee, died with a cup of tea drunk to the dregs. The first tea was refused, do you not see? Honoria would not drink it. She sat by her fire all evening with the cup beside her, and never touched it, and she died anyway. Her heart, the worn-out heart, it needed no poison, it needed only a shock, only a fright, only something coming up the drive at last, and afterwards the cup had to be emptied and washed, because an untouched cup of tea looks like nothing but an untouched cup of tea in the good china, beside a woman who favoured a cracked one, looks like exactly what it was. She came a step further into the hall. Vera drank hers, at 6:30 this morning, in the dark, with a visitor, the visitor she had telephoned, the visitor she had summoned, who came at dawn by the back lane, which is why no one saw, and Vera made tea for her visitor, because Vera had young manners and not old ones, and to Vera tea was what you made when someone came, even someone you hated. She drank her own cup to the dregs, and then she picked up the crate and started down the stair, in the dark, and the 4th rod turned under her heel, the 4th rod that Judson swears was tight in August, and the visitor, who knew this house, who had lived in this house for 2 years and knew which stair you must miss in the dark, stood at the bottom and watched her come down. The hall was very silent. Outside, beyond the constable, the little crowd at the gate stirred like barley. "Mrs. Pratt," said Slack at last, slowly, as if the name were heavy. "Mrs. Pratt, who was on the 7 o'clock bus to the north on Monday morning. 40 hours gone, in front of witnesses. She'd been cried over in the inn on the Sunday night, and she left with her boxes on the Monday, and the whole village saw her go." He stared at Miss Marple. Unless she didn't go where the bus went, unless a woman can get off a bus at the next stop, and a tram and a train can bring her back by Tuesday dawn to a house where she's been summoned, by a girl holding letters. He was moving now, towards the door, the energy coming back into him like blood into a limb, the exchange, the trunk office. A call to the north last night to the niece's address will be logged if Pratt telephoned Euphemia to say she'd be home Wednesday, or if someone telephoned Pratt. Inspector. Miss Marple's voice stopped him at the door, and there was something in it that had never been in the vicarage parlour. "You are going about it the wrong way again. The fast way, the young man's way. Trains and telephones. Sit down one moment. There is time. There has been time for 40 years. There is time for 1 cup of tea." She set the absurd milk bottle down on the hall table beside the empty tin box and folded her hands. "The letters are gone, yes, but I do not need the letters because I have the cup. I have had the cup since the first morning. The cracked cup, Inspector, that Honoria called her conscience, that she turned in her hands at night, that she said was coming up the drive. Vera found it among the tea things on Sunday, wrapping the derby. She brought it to me that evening because I had asked about it, and because she trusted the old pussy who knits. It is at my house now, in my dresser, and the crack in it, Inspector, the brown crack, that no scrubbing ever cleaned, is not a crack in the glaze at all." Slack stood very still. "It is writing," said Miss Marple. "Hair fine, brown on white, inside the bowl, under the tea stain of 40 years, a name and a date and a place, scratched with a diamond, a governess's diamond, a brooch stone, the only jewel a governess ever owns. I sat up last night with my magnifying glass, and I read it, and I know the name of the great house up north where Honoria was governess, and I know what happened there in the winter of the date she scratched, and I know, as poor Honoria knew, as Mrs. Pratt has always known, whose child was buried in a churchyard under another woman's name, and whose money has been paying for that child's silence ever since. Her voice did not rise at all. It sank rather into the stillness, and the two men bent to hear it. "And the murderer, Inspector, the real one, the one nobody noticed, is not on any bus to the north. The murderer never left St. Mary Mead. The murderer has been at every tea and every fete for 12 years, and was at Honoria's funeral on Friday, crying in all the right places. Come to my house at 4 o'clock, bring your notebook, and bring Dr. Haydock, and I will show you the cup, and I will tell you a story about a parrot, which on the surface will seem to have nothing to do with it." She took up her milk bottle and her basket, and walked out past the chalk mark on the flags and the spilled books, and down the path between the staring faces at the gate, small and grey and unhurried, like a woman going home to make jam. And at the gate she paused, once, and looked back at the house, and then at the crowd, slowly, face by face, as if she were counting them, and then she went on down the lane, and no one among the watchers afterwards could have sworn whether her eyes had rested on them or not. Section 8. The Baited Parlour. She went on down the lane, and no one among the watchers afterwards could have sworn whether her eyes had rested on them or not. But by noon every parlour in St. Mary Mead knew two things: that old Miss Marple had something up her sleeve, and that at 4 o'clock there was to be tea at her house, to which Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock were bidden, and to which, at Miss Marple's particular request, conveyed through Griselda Clement, the ladies of the Funeral Baking Committee were also invited, as it seemed only right that those who had been so kind should hear what there was to hear. Miss Hartnell accepted with both hands. Mrs. Price Ridley accepted with a shawl. Little Mrs. Cray, encountered by Griselda at the baker's, went a queer colour and said she wasn't sure, she had the hall's linen to see to, and then, when Griselda, with the blundering persistence that was her charm, insisted, said in her small crushed voice that she would come, and stood a long time at the baker's counter afterwards, looking at her hands. At 4 o'clock precisely, Miss Marple's parlour held them all. The inspector, large and suspicious, wedged into the small armchair, Haydock, grey-faced, by the window, the 3 committee ladies in a row on the sofa like birds on a rail, Griselda presiding over the tea with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and Miss Marple herself in her best lace cap, pouring, pink and woolly and mild, with a small table at her elbow on which sat, covered with a cloth, like something in a séance, an object about which nobody liked to ask. "How very kind of you all to come," said Miss Marple. "One is so grateful for company at these times. Mrs. Cray, a little more milk. You are looking tired, my dear. The hall's linen, I hear, is a great responsibility. 12 years you have done it now, is it not? Ever since you came to us?" 11 years, thank you," said Mrs. Cray faintly, and then, with a little start, as if she had heard her own voice from a distance. 12. 12 come November. One loses count." "One does," said Miss Marple sympathetically, "though I always think the hands keep count, even when the memory doesn't. My mother used to say she could tell a woman's trade from her hands at 20 paces. Yours now, Mrs. Cray." She peered kindly across the tea-table. "Yours puzzle me. You told the Women's Institute, I think, that you were in service as a parlour-maid before your marriage. But parlour-maids have such soft hands, you know. It is all dusting and discretion, and yours are a washerwoman's hands. My mother would have known them anywhere. The knuckles, you see. It is the soda that does it. Soda is very hard on the hands." There was a silence of the kind that has a texture. Mrs. Cray's hands closed quietly over each other in her lap, like 2 small animals going to earth. "I did a little laundry work," she said. "In my first place, one did whatever one was told, in those days." "How true," said Miss Marple. "In those days, yes. And it reminds me, you will forgive an old woman's wandering. Inspector Slack has heard this story before and thinks it has nothing to do with anything, of Mrs. Saunders at the post office years ago. A sad case. Her husband poisoned her parrot, a long story, and quite another matter. And the way she knew, Inspector, the way she knew, was that he always wiped the perch. He was not a man who had ever wiped anything in his life, you see. It is never the large things. The large things are what people arrange for you to see. It is the small things they forget to arrange, or rather, the small things they cannot help doing, because their hands have done them for 40 years. Habit is a rail, as poor Honoria used to say. One's whole life runs along it, and at the end of the line the hands are still working, even when the heart has stopped. She set down her cup and with small deliberate fingers drew the cloth from the object on the table beside her. It was a teacup, plain white, gold-rimmed once, and down its side a long brown crack, like a vein, like a river on an old map. "Honoria's cup," said Miss Marple. "The cracked one, the one she called her conscience. Vera Larch gave it into my keeping on Sunday evening, and I have sat up 2 nights with it and my magnifying glass, and I will tell you what I found, but first I will tell you where I found it so clean, for that is the interesting thing. This cup was used on Thursday evening, the last Thursday of poor Honoria's life, for her 8 o'clock cocoa, as always. Edith Pratt washed the supper things at 7:30 and went up to bed at 8:45, leaving the cocoa cup, as she always did, for the morning. She has told me so herself, and Edith Pratt, whatever else may be said of her, does not lie. I have watched her hands, you see, when she speaks, and they are quite quiet, and yet at 7 o'clock on Friday morning, when she came down and found her mistress dead, this cup stood on the dresser, washed, dried, polished, put away. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes went slowly along the sofa. Somebody washed that cup in the night, in a dead woman's kitchen. Not the woman of the house, she was upstairs, and she has told me so, and her hands are quiet. Somebody else. Somebody who could no more have left a dirty cup standing than she could have stopped breathing. Somebody whose whole life has been the washing of other people's stains, and who washes in soda, Inspector, for this cup smelled of it still, under the tea-rose scent of poor Honoria's kitchen soap. Soda, the laundress's friend, very hard on the hands. Nobody moved. The clock ticked. Outside, a late bumblebee shouldered against the window-pane and was gone. "Anyone might use soda," said Mrs. Cray. Her voice came out small and dry, like a thing that has been kept too long in a cupboard. "There's no kitchen in England without a packet of soda." "No, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "Anyone might. But you see, I have not mentioned the soda to a living soul until this minute. Not to Inspector Slack, not to Dr. Haydock, not to Edith Pratt. And yet you knew the cup had been washed. You knew it before I said so. You have been looking at your hands, Mrs. Cray, ever since you sat down." Mrs. Cray looked up. It was, everyone in the room afterwards agreed, the strangest thing they had ever seen. The small, crushed, apologetic face did not change at all, and yet it came entirely apart, the way wet paper comes apart, without moving. "The inscription inside the cup," Miss Marple went on, and her voice was very soft now, almost tender, "is scratched with a diamond, a governess's brooch stone, the only jewel a governess ever owns. 3 lines, Inspector, under 40 years of tea stain, a name, a date, a place. The name is Lily. The date is the 14th of February, 1890. The place is Aldersey Hall, Cumberland, and there is a 4th line, very small, very shaky, as if the hand that held the brooch was old when it was done." She lifted the cup, and for a moment held it in both hands, as Honoria had held it, turning it and turning it. "The 4th line says, 'Forgive me. I only held my tongue.'" She looked at Mrs. Cray, and Mrs. Cray looked back at her, and the parlour was so quiet that they could hear, from the garden, the ordinary sounds of St. Mary Mead going about its ordinary evening, a gate, a whistle, the distant clatter of the fishmonger's van, quite indifferent, quite unchanged, while in the little lace-curtained room a woman sat looking at her hands as if she had never seen them before. "I am not going to ask you anything now," said Miss Marple, with a gentleness that was more terrible than any question. "Tomorrow will do. But I think you should know, my dear, that Edith Pratt is on her way back to us, Inspector Slack telegraphed her this morning, and that the girl Euphemia will be here tomorrow. There are some things that should be said to faces, and not to backs." Mrs. Cray rose. She stood a moment, smoothing her skirt with her ruined hands, in the little ladylike way she had smoothed it at 100 teas, at 100 fetes, on 100 vicarage lawns. Then she walked to the door, and stopped, and said, "To the door, not to the room," in her small, crushed voice. "Lily had hair like the inside of a chestnut. Nobody ever knew that but me." Then she went out, softly, and closed the door behind her without a sound. Section 9. What the cup held. She closed the door behind her without a sound, and for a long moment nobody in the parlour moved at all. It was Inspector Slack who broke first, exploding out of the small armchair with a force that rocked the tea table. "Good God," said Slack. "She, good God. The cake woman. I've had her down in my notes as witness no account. She sat in my office for 20 minutes and I offered her a cup of tea." He was at the door in 3 strides, and then, with his hand on the knob, he stopped, a thing those who knew him had rarely seen him do, and turned back. "No," he said more slowly. "No. Tomorrow will do, as you said. There's nowhere she can go that a telegraph can't reach, and I don't fancy chasing her through the lanes like a dog after a hare. Not after that." He came back and stood over the little table, looking down at the cracked cup as another man might look down at a loaded pistol. "Tell me the rest of it, Miss Marple. All of it. From the beginning." "From the beginning," said Miss Marple, "is a winter night in Cumberland, 46 years ago. But we will take it in order, Inspector, as it came to me, which was not in order at all, but in pieces, the way one finds a broken plate. The first piece was the dustbin lid." She folded her hands. "Judson sets a lid straight. 30 years of bins and never a crooked one. So on Thursday night somebody was at that bin, in the dark, in a hurry. People do not put things into dustbins at night. The bins go out on Tuesday. Anything you put in on Thursday sits there till Tuesday, witness of everything. No, somebody took something out. And what does one take out of a dustbin? Not property. Paper. Something written that one suddenly cannot afford to have found. A letter, perhaps, or an envelope. An envelope is quite as dangerous as a letter, Inspector. It has a name on it, and a direction, and a postmark with a date. Honoria received a letter that week that she crumpled and threw away. She was not a crumpler as a rule. She was a governess. She filed things. Whatever she threw away that week, she threw away in anger or in contempt, and the person who wrote it came back in the night and fetched it. "Cray," said Slack. "Cray wrote to her. Someone wrote to her, and Honoria, who was fair, governess fair, scrupulous to the bone, had herself written to that same person on the Wednesday. That was what she meant. That Wednesday night, when she sat turning this cup and said, 'It's coming, Edith. It's coming up the drive.' She had written her letter that day. She had told someone that the silence was over, that she had made a full written account, and that after the Sunday service she meant to take it to the vicar. She gave fair warning. It was the fairest thing she did in 46 years, and the least wise. Miss Marple's voice was dry and quiet, and on Thursday night the answer came up the drive, in person, after Edith had gone up to bed. The front door was on the latch, as every door in this village is on the latch. That is the thing, Inspector, that your town mind never grasps about us. In St. Mary Mead a murderer does not break in. She knocks, and is made welcome, and sits down by the fire, and is offered tea. "The tea," said Haydock from the window, "the Crown Derby cup, that nobody drank. The tea was ordered at 8:30. Honoria asked Edith for it, the good china, and told her to go up early. That was not caprice, Doctor. That was a hostess preparing for a guest she did not choose to name. Honoria expected her correspondent that night, and she meant to receive her properly, with the good china, in the parlour, governess to the end. The visitor came, the tea was poured, and then I think the visitor said what she had come to say, and it was not an answer to a letter. It was a threat. She had come to make Honoria destroy her written account, and when Honoria refused, and Honoria would refuse, she had been refusing her own conscience for 46 years, and had finally stopped. The visitor told her what silence would cost if it were broken, and what speech would cost. She would deny everything. She would swear the child had been Honoria's own, an old governess, a dead scandal, who was to disprove it. She would drag Edith Pratt's name through every court and every newspaper in the north, and Euphemia, the girl, the granddaughter, would be ruined before she had begun. A dispenser's girl, her living depending on respectability, branded with a bastard grandmother and a stolen mother, and a grave in Aldersea churchyard with the wrong name on the stone. Miss Marple's hands tightened very slightly in her lap. Honoria was 74, and her heart was worn out, and the woman by her fire knew it, had watched her for 12 years, had sat with her at every fete, had counted, I dare say, the very pauses in her breath. She did not touch her. She did not need to touch her. She simply did not stop talking. And presently Honoria Wren, who had noticed everything all her life, sat very still in her chair and noticed nothing any more. The fire settled in the grate. Slack had taken out his notebook and put it away again without writing. "And then," said Miss Marple, "the hands began their work. She emptied nothing, touched nothing large, but the curtains troubled her. She knew something was done with curtains when there was a death, and she drew them part way and lost her nerve. She had been in service. But below stairs, a laundry maid, in and out daily. The ways of front rooms were not her ways. She looked for the written account and could not find it. Honoria kept it in a tin box at the back of the wardrobe, under her winter things. And a laundress does not search a wardrobe, Inspector. A wardrobe is linen, and she would not disturb what her hands knew. But she found the kitchen bin, and her own letter, the envelope with her name in Honoria's writing, and that she took, and the lid went back crooked, because the dark is no respecter of 30 years' practice. And then, in the scullery, she saw the cracked cup, Honoria's cocoa cup, unwashed, as it always waited for morning, and she washed it, in soda, from the packet under the sink, the way her hands had washed 10,000 things. She could not have left it. You must understand that about her. She could not have left it. She had washed the Ransom's linen in the year Lily was born. She had washed the stain of that family off her hands every day of her life since, and the one stain she could never reach was inside the cup, in writing, so she washed the outside. It is the saddest thing I know about her, and there is nothing about her that is not sad. Cumberland, said Slack gruffly. Aldersea Hall, the Ransom family. What exactly happened there, and who can prove it? Because so far, Miss Marple, you have given me a washerwoman's hands and a smell of soda, and no jury in England. Edith Pratt can prove it, said Miss Marple. She was there. She was 16, and it was her child. The room had gone very still again, and into the stillness Miss Marple told it, quietly, without emphasis, as one reads a lesson. Aldersea Hall, February 1890. Edith Pratt, a still-room maid of 16, brought to bed of a child on the 14th of February, in the servants' wing, in a blizzard, and in the same week, in the village beyond the park gates. Clara Bell, a laundry maid, newly married, newly bereaved, had her own child born dead. Young Gerald Ransom was the father of the living child. Old Mrs. Ransom was the author of the rest. It was managed in a night, the way such things were managed in great houses. The dead child was carried to the churchyard in a small coffin and buried under the name of Edith's daughter, a child buried under another woman's name, and the living child, the little girl with hair like the inside of a chestnut, was carried out of the house by Clara Bell and raised as her own, as the dead infant miraculously living 40 miles away in Carlisle, where nobody knew either of them. Honoria Wren, the governess, 26 years old, had been sent for in the night to help. The doctor was the Ransom's man, and signed whatever he was told to sign, and Honoria had held the living child and known which child went into the ground, and held her tongue. She was young, and her place was her bread, and she told herself it was not her business. She told herself that for 46 years, and then she came home to retire, to St. Mary Mead, and found, 3 years later, that Clara Cray, widowed, had moved into the village before her, with the Hall's laundry contract in her hands, and 40 years of shared silence between them like a wall and like a chain. Edith learnt the truth 2 years ago, said Miss Marple. Lily, the child, grew up believing herself Clara's own, married a Carlisle printer named Pratt, Edith's own nephew, by one of those coincidences that are not coincidences at all, since the Pratt family had taken the girl in hand kindly when her husband died, and died herself in 1913, leaving a baby daughter, Euphemia. Edith had gone north after her disgrace, had been near her family, had watched the girl grow up, her own grandchild, Mrs. Price Ridley, do you see, her daughter's daughter, whom the world calls her great niece, and she never knew, she never guessed, until 2 years ago, when the last of old Mrs. Ransom's executors died, and some papers came loose, and the truth came within her reach at last. She traced Honoria. She answered an advertisement for a companion, an advertisement Honoria had placed, I believe, half hoping, half fearing, that Providence would answer it in exactly that way. And she came here, and for 2 years those 2 old women sat in that little parlour with 46 years of silence between them, and Honoria paid for the girl's training, and made her will, and told no one, and Edith asked no questions, because she had learned, the way the poor learn, that you'll take what you're given and hold your tongue. But the will, the money, the girl said. Blood money, said Slack. At the bus stop, witnessed. And so it was, said Miss Marple. Honoria told Edith the whole of it this August, when Euphemia came down. She saw the girl's face. You see, Lily's face over again, and it broke her at last, she told Edith. Edith told the girl, and the girl, who is young and proud and has nothing, looked at the money and called it by its right name, blood money, and would not take it. And Edith, who has spent her whole life taking what she was given and holding her tongue, quarrelled with her in the street about it, and came home and cried into her apron, and Honoria heard her, and that night wrote her letter, the fair warning, the end of the silence. Miss Marple looked round the little circle of faces. You see what she had decided, all of you. She had decided that the truth at last was worth more than the money. She was the only one of them who had ever thought so. There was a knock at the door. 2 knocks, actually, one firm and one timid, arriving together. Griselda went to answer it, and came back with her eyes very round, and behind her came Edith Pratt, travel-worn, upright, with her shut-cupboard face and her quiet hands, and behind her, holding the door as though it were the side of a ship in a sea, a plain, neat girl of 23, with a hold-all, and hair, though only 2 people in the room could have known it, like the inside of a chestnut. You telegraphed, miss, said Edith Pratt to Miss Marple. We've come. Section 10. The Reveal. We've come, said Edith Pratt, and Miss Marple rose, and took the woman's quiet hands in her own soft old ones, and said the simplest and most terrible thing that had been said in that parlour yet. Then, my dear, you are in time. Sit down, both of you. Inspector, ring the bell for more tea. No one can hear a story like this one without tea. It would be inhuman. And then I will tell you all what happened. Not what the coroner will say happened, but what happened, and when I have finished, you will understand why the murder only one person noticed was noticed by the one person in St. Mary Mead who could not possibly have prevented it. They sat. Griselda, pale for once, poured. The girl Euphemia sat bolt upright with her hold-all on her knee like a shield, and Edith Pratt sat beside her with her cupboard face and her folded hands, and outside the lace curtains the September dusk came down over the garden, and Miss Marple began. Clara Cray came to St. Mary Mead 12 years ago, a widow with a good character and the Hall's laundry contract, and she chose this village, as you will see, Inspector, when you think, because Honoria Wren had chosen it first. Where Honoria went, there Clara must follow. It was not hatred. It was worse than hatred. It was the tie of the shared thing. Neither of them could ever be safe from the other, and so neither of them could ever let the other out of her sight. For 12 years they lived 2 streets apart, and took tea together, and served on committees together, and each of them watched the other grow old, like 2 prisoners chained to the opposite walls of one cell. Honoria kept the cup, her conscience she called it, and Clara kept her hands busy. 12 years, and it might have gone on to the grave, both graves, if Edith Pratt had not traced her grandchild's mother to this village and answered an advertisement, and walked up the drive of the old schoolhouse with her hold-all on a spring afternoon 2 years ago. Edith Pratt spoke then for the first time low, correct, and without tears, as if she were reporting the linen to a housekeeper. I knew her the moment I saw her, Miss Wren, I mean. I'd been 16, and she'd held my baby in the night and wrapped her, and looked at me once, and I never forgot the look. And she knew me. She took my references. They were real. I'd been 30 years in good places, and she read them, and she said, "You've come for the money, or you've come for the truth, and I can only give you one of them." I said, "The truth, ma'am." I'd waited 40 years to say it, and she engaged me on the spot, and that night she showed me the cup. Edith's voice did not change, but her hands, for the first time in Miss Marple's knowledge of her, were not quiet. She'd written the truth inside a cup with a diamond brooch, the night after my baby was born, because she was 26 and afraid, and writing it inside a cup was the only confession she could afford. She said, "I've carried it 40 years, Edith, and it's heavier than you ever carried her." And from that night we never spoke of it again, not one word, in 2 years. But every evening we had our cocoa, and she'd turn that cup in her hands, and it was all said, every evening, all of it. "And this August," said Miss Marple, "Euphemia came down, and Honoria saw Lily's face walking about in the world, and the silence ended. She told Edith everything. She told the girl. She made her will, the money to Euphemia. Blood money, as the child rightly called it, because it was paid for Lily's blood, and Lily's name, and Lily's grave under another woman's daughter's stone. And then Honoria did the fatal thing, the brave, fair, governess thing. She wrote to Clara Cray and told her that on Sunday after the service she was going to the vicar with a written statement, the whole of it, the 2 babies, the blizzard, the substitution, the grave in Aldersea churchyard, and the name of the child's father. She told me the reason herself, 10 days before she died, at the bring and buy, and I was too slow, God forgive me, I was too slow to hear it. She said, 'One's past has a way of catching one up, Jane, rather like a bill, and mine is sitting in my kitchen at this very moment, shelling peas.' She meant Edith. She meant the debt had come due, and she was glad of it. And she added, 'And I shall hear this in my mind, I think, for the rest of my life. There's another lady in this village, Jane, who's been paying the same bill a great deal longer than I have, and she's paid it in the only coin she had.' The parlour was absolutely still. Clara came on the Thursday night, Miss Marple went on. Edith had gone up at 8:45. Honoria received her with the good china, governess to the end, and Clara talked, and Honoria's heart, which needed no hand laid upon it, stopped under the weight of the talking. That was the first death, and in law, Inspector, I dare say it was not murder at all. That was the devilish cleverness of it, if a grief like Clara's can be called clever. Frighten an old woman to death with the truth about her own shame, and the kind country doctor signs the kind country certificate, and no one is to blame, and the written statement is never found, and the silence resumes. But then, Miss Marple's voice dropped. Then the thing happened that Clara could not have foreseen. Vera found the tin box. Vera found the letters, for there were letters, Inspector, her own, that Honoria had not thrown away but filed, governess fashion, every one. And Vera, who was young and had her aunt's eyes and none of her aunt's fear, telephoned the person those letters named, and summoned her at dawn to hear what she proposed. And what she proposed was the one thing Clara Cray could not survive. Not exposure. Vera didn't want the police. She wanted the grave put right. She wanted the stone in Aldersea churchyard recut with Lily's true name on it. She wanted it done decently, quietly, face to face, the 2 families together. She offered mercy. Miss Marple looked round the little circle, and that was what killed her. You must understand that. A threat, Clara could have answered. A threat would have been in the family of everything Clara had lived with for 46 years. But mercy, a child of 26, offering to put Lily's name on the stone quietly, kindly, without the police, asking nothing. Mercy meant the whole 46 years had been unnecessary, that she had lied and frightened and hidden and washed, and Honoria had held her tongue and paid, and all of it, might have been ended at any time by one kind word. People will kill to avoid exposure, Inspector, and it is a common thing and the police understand it, but people will kill far more readily to avoid forgiveness. Forgiveness takes the whole meaning of their life away. Slack was standing. The stair rod, he said. She knew the house. 2 years. No, not she. Miss Marple checked herself, and a small, grim, wintry smile touched her mouth. You see how easy it is to confuse them, Inspector. The village confused them for 12 years. 2 women, of an age, of a height, grey-haired, soft-spoken, self-effacing, always at the edge of every photograph and the back of every pew, the companion and the laundress, the 2 invisible women of St. Mary Mead. Even I, and she said it with a humility that had nothing theatrical in it, even I, for 1 whole day, believed Edith Pratt had washed that cup, and I telegraphed her north, and God be thanked I did, because her answer reached the yardsman this morning, and the Yorkshire police have Clara Cray's movements for the whole of Monday, and they do not fit the story she will tell. She never went north, Edith. She got off the bus at Much Benham and went to ground in a temperance hotel, and on Tuesday before dawn she walked back up the back lane in the dark, as she had walked to the hall laundry 40 years ago, and Vera let her in, and made her tea, and told her what she proposed, over the cups, the good Crown Derby, because Vera, like her aunt, believed you received even your enemy with the good china, and Clara drank her tea, and listened to mercy being offered to her, and got up and went out, knowing the girl would carry the crate down in the dark within the half-hour, and that the fourth rod, loosened on Monday night, when she came back through the empty house to look for the letters she'd failed to find in September, the fourth rod would do the rest. She didn't push Vera, Inspector. She didn't need to. She had learnt from Honoria's death that you do not have to touch people to kill them. You only have to leave them alone with what you have arranged. She'll deny it, said Slack. She will, agreed Miss Marple. And then you will show her the envelope, the one she took from the dustbin in September and could not burn, because it had her name on it in Honoria's writing, and she could no more destroy a thing with a name on it than she could leave a dirty cup. It will be in her bag or her bodice, Inspector, carefully folded. You will find it, and you will show her the stair rod and the Yorkshire Hotel register, and then you will show her this. She lifted the cracked cup, and I think she will tell you everything, not because of the evidence, but because in 46 years no one has ever asked her. That is what I meant when I said the murder only one person noticed was noticed by the one person who could not prevent it. Not me, not the police. Honoria. Miss Marple's eyes filled quite suddenly, pink and bright, and she looked down at the cup in her hands. Honoria noticed Clara, from the first day 12 years ago. She noticed her, the way you notice a shadow that follows you home. She noticed her washing the chapel linen with those ruined hands. She noticed her at the back of every funeral, crying in all the right places. She noticed what the whole of St. Mary Mead never saw, that the kindest, quietest, most harmless woman in the village was a woman living on the far side of a 40-year lie, with a daughter's grave she could never visit, and a granddaughter she could never claim, and a rage in her with nowhere to go but inward. Honoria noticed her, and noticing her, knowing what she herself had helped to make of her, Honoria could not act, and could not forget, and could not forgive herself, and it wore her heart out years before its time, as surely as any arsenic. Clara frightened her to death one Thursday night in September, but Honoria had been dying of noticing Clara for 12 years. There is the murder, Inspector. There are no statutes for it, but I have known it for what it was since the first morning, and I am very old, and I have never yet been wrong about people, and I am not wrong now. The fire had burned low. Griselda was weeping openly into her sleeve. Euphemia sat rigid, her hold all clutched, staring at the cracked cup, at the name inside it, her mother's name, written in diamond by a frightened young governess in the year 1890. And Edith Pratt rose at last, and crossed the little room, and stood behind Miss Marple's chair, and laid her quiet hands on the back of it, and said, to the room, to the dusk, to no one, she said to me once, "Edith, you and I will outlive them all, and one day we'll sit in the sun, and it won't matter. She's gone, and it matters, it matters." And outside, through the lace curtains, they heard the constable's tread on the garden path, and Slack drew himself up, and put on his hat, and went to the door, a large man, going quietly for once, to do the smallest and heaviest part of his work. Section 11. Village Equilibrium. Slack went to do his work, and he did it quietly, which surprised nobody who had been in Miss Marple's parlour that evening. Clara Cray was arrested at her own gate at 6:30, in her hat and coat, with her basket on her arm. She had been on her way, it seemed, to Evensong, and she made no trouble of any kind. She gave the inspector the folded envelope from her bodice before he asked for it, the way another woman might hand over a raffle ticket, and at the station, when he set the cracked cup on the table before her, she looked at it a long time, and then she talked for 3 hours, steadily, in her small crushed voice, while 2 stenographers relieved each other and the gas ring kettle in the corner boiled and nobody made the tea. She began with the blizzard, and the washing on the horses in the laundry, and young Mr. Gerald's laugh, and she ended with Vera's face in the dawn light, offering her mercy over the good Crown Derby. She said we'd do it quiet and kind, Clara told them. 46 years I'd been paying, and she said it could be done quiet and kind. You can't let a person say that to you. It takes everything you've got left. The inquest on Vera was adjourned, and then there was no need of an inquest, and the assizes were in December, and the judge, who was old and tired and had a granddaughter, put on the black cap with an air of personal reluctance, and then took it off again, and sentenced her to penal servitude for life. On the grounds, he said, off the record in the robing room, that there were worse things in that dock than the law had names for. She was in the infirmary by spring. She died 2 years later, and the matron said afterwards that she had been the best laundress the prison had ever had, and that her hands at the end were very quiet. The village absorbed it, as the village absorbed everything. For a month it was the only subject. Mrs. Price Ridley had always known there was something queer. Miss Hartnell had it on the best authority that the Hall was involved, and the post office did a brisk trade in newspapers from London with St. Mary Mead murder sensation in the stop press. Then the daffodils came, and the spring fete loomed, and the vicar's curate became engaged to a girl from Much Benham, and the whole thing settled down into the village's deep silt of memory, to be brought up years later on winter evenings, embroidered, softened, and already half legendary. That is the way of villages. They are like ponds. A stone goes in, the rings spread and spread, the whole surface is troubled, and then the surface lies still again, and the stone is part of the bottom. The old schoolhouse was sold in the spring to a retired naval man and his wife, who repainted the door blue and knew nothing, and Judson stayed on and taught the new dahlias to stand to attention, and the only sign that anything had ever happened there was that the fourth stair rod, renewed, was screwed down by the builder with a ferocity that amounted, in a builder, to a wreath. Edith Pratt did not go back to the north. Euphemia took the money in the end because Vera was dead and there was no one else, and because Edith sat her down in the Blue Boar parlour and said, "It was blood money when it was bought with silence. It's wages now. Take it." She took it and finished her training and came back, which surprised everyone but Miss Marple. There is a shortage of good dispensers in country districts, and by the following autumn Euphemia was established at the surgery with Dr. Haydock, who growled at her twice a day and trusted her completely, which was his way. Edith took a room at the top of the village, and on Sunday afternoons she and Euphemia walked up to the churchyard, where there were 2 new graves by the east wall, side by side. Honoria Wren, said the first, and in her end was her beginning. The second said only Vera Larch, beloved niece, and underneath, very small, she noticed. It had been Miss Marple's suggestion, and the vicar had thought it odd and allowed it anyway, which was also his way, and in the spring it was Edith who arranged it, with Miss Marple's help, and a solicitor's letter that took 3 months. A party went up to Cumberland, quietly, in 2 hired cars. Edith, Euphemia, the vicar, and a monumental mason from Carlisle. There was no fuss. The old stone in Aldersey churchyard was lifted and recut, and what it had said for 50 years, Clara, infant daughter of, was planed away, and in its place, in new sharp letters that caught the north country light, was the truth at last. Lily, daughter of Edith Pratt, born February 14th, 1890, died 1913, beloved. The child buried there had not been Lily, of course. The child buried there had never had a name at all, having been born dead to a laundress and buried under a lie. But nobody troubled over that. "The stone is for Lily," Edith said, standing in the wind with her hat held on. "Wherever she is, she'll know which is hers, and the little one that's here, poor mite, she carried my girl's name for 50 years. She's welcome to go on carrying it," which was, the vicar said afterwards, the soundest theology he had heard in 30 years of parish work. They came home in the evening, and Edith got down from the car at Miss Marple's gate, because there was one more thing to be done, and it had to be done there. Miss Marple was in the garden, in the spring dusk, tying up the roses. On the rustic table by the door stood the cracked cup. The police had returned it in January, in a box labelled Exhibit, and Miss Marple had written to Euphemia to ask if she wanted it, and Euphemia had written back, in her small, hard, upright hand, that was so like Vera's, "It belongs to the 2 of you. Do what Honoria would have done." "Well, my dear," said Miss Marple, straightening up with her secateurs in her hand. "It's done, then." "It's done," said Edith. "Her name's on the stone, in the light, where everyone can read it. 50 years it's been dark, and now it's done." They stood together a moment, the 2 old women, in the smell of the turned earth and the early roses. "Then," said Miss Marple gently, "I think it is time, don't you? She carried it for 46 years, and then I carried it for a little, and it has been very faithful as cups go. But a conscience, my dear, is not an heirloom. It's a debt, and the debt is paid." Edith picked up the cup from the table. She held it as Honoria had held it, turned in both hands, with the brown crack, the hair-fine writing, the name and the date and the place, and forgive me, I only held my tongue, catching the last of the light. She looked at it a long time, then she set it down on the flat top of the gatepost, and Miss Marple took up the little garden hammer from the table. She had put it there ready, because she had known, as she always knew, and Edith took the hammer and struck the cup once, cleanly, and it broke into pieces too small to hold anything at all, ever again. They gathered the pieces into a paper bag, and Edith carried them to the churchyard in the morning, and put them in the earth of the grave under the east wall, which was as near to Lily's stone as the two old women could manage, and which was, they both felt, though neither said it, exactly where a governess's conscience belonged. That summer Miss Marple's garden was particularly fine, and the fete was a great success, and Griselda's sandwiches kept to egg, and life in St. P. Mary Mead resumed its ancient, tranquil, mildly malicious course, like a river going back between its banks after a flood. Doors went back on the latch. Teas were given and attended. The Women's Institute had a talk on old cottage industries, and nobody mentioned laundry. The pond lay still. Only, on winter evenings when the fire was low and the curtains fully drawn, Miss Marple sometimes sat a little longer over her knitting than was usual, and her needles clicked, soft and regular, like a clock thinking, and if you had asked her what she was thinking of, which nobody ever did, because in St. Mary Mead everyone knew better than to ask Miss Marple what she was thinking, she would have said, with that mild, woolly, misleading vagueness of hers, that she was thinking of the two old women in the parlour with the cup between them, and of the girl with the chestnut hair who had carried her own murderer her tea in the good china, and of how the whole of it, the whole long sorrow, had been seen, from the first day to the last, by exactly one pair of grey, attentive governess eyes. The murder only one person noticed, she said once, to Griselda, who had asked her idly, at the fete, whether she missed the excitement. No, my dear, it isn't the noticing that matters. Everyone notices in the end. It is the forgiving that takes the time. 50 years, in that family. She adjusted her hat against the wind off the lawns, and looked round the bright, chattering, harmless, murderous little world of the fete with her gentle blue eyes. Hand me my bag, would you, dear? And mind your sleeve in the dahlias. They're the only things in this village that are exactly what they seem. The end.